Picture two men standing outside a village somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, roughly 4,000 years ago. One is notably taller than the other, maybe by 4 or 5 inches, which in a world where average heights were somewhat lower than today would make the difference visually striking. They are both healthy, both strong, both capable fighters, experienced hunters, respected within their community. Now here is the question nobody thinks to ask. Did anyone around them care which one was taller? The instinctive modern answer is yes, obviously. Height advantages in the contemporary world are documented extensively. Taller people earn more money on average, win more elections, are perceived as more dominant, more competent, more attractive across a range of studies conducted in modern Western populations. The association between height and status is so embedded in current cultural experience that it feels like a biological constant, something ancient and hardwired rather than something contingent and constructed. But is it? Did the people of ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, prehistoric steppe, the early agricultural villages of the Fertile Crescent, the hunter-gatherer bands of the African savanna, did they organize their social hierarchies around height the way modern research suggests contemporary humans do? Did a taller man automatically command more respect? Did height predict leadership, mating success, social dominance in the ancient world, the way popular evolutionary psychology sometimes implies it did across all of human history? The answer, investigated seriously across multiple disciplines, archaeology, paleoanthropology, classical history, evolutionary biology, cross-cultural psychology, turns out to be significantly more complicated and considerably more interesting than the modern height premium narrative would suggest. And the complications reveal something important not just about ancient societies, but about what height actually represents biologically and why humans may have developed preferences around it in the first place. Start with what we know about height's biological meaning, because that foundation changes everything that follows. In any environment where food is scarce and variable, where infectious disease is common, and immune challenges are frequent, where physical development during childhood is subject to significant environmental disruption, which describes essentially every environment humans lived in before the 20th century, adult height is not primarily a measure of genetic advantage. It is primarily a measure of developmental success. A person who reached a tall adult height in an ancient environment did so because they received adequate nutrition throughout their growth years, because they survived pathogen challenges without the severe immune stress that diverts growth resources, because they avoided the psychosocial stress that chronically elevates cortisol and suppresses growth hormone secretion, and because they were fortunate enough to experience all of this during every critical window of the 2-decade developmental period during which height is determined. In other words, a tall ancient human was advertising something real, a history of good conditions, good resources, and developmental success. The height was a physical record of those advantages, visible in the body, impossible to fake without actually having experienced them. This is the evolutionary logic behind height preferences if they exist. Not that tall people are inherently better at any specific task. The relationship between height and physical performance in most tasks is much weaker than popular assumption suggests. But that height in resource-limited environments is a reliable signal of developmental history, which predicts health, immune competence, and likely genetic quality in ways that are relevant to both social alliance and mating decisions. But this logic only holds in environments where height is genuinely environmentally sensitive. In conditions where nutrition is consistently adequate, where disease burden is low, where developmental disruption is rare, height variation between individuals becomes increasingly dominated by genetic factors rather than environmental ones. The signal becomes noisier. And in those conditions, the reliable link between tall stature and developmental success weakens. Ancient human environments were strongly in the sensitive signal category. Food availability was variable. Disease burden was significant. Developmental disruption was common. In those conditions, height carried real information, and attending to it as a social signal had logic behind it. Whether ancient humans actually attended to it consciously, culturally, systematically. That is the empirical question, and the answer requires looking at the evidence rather than extrapolating from modern preferences. The archaeological record provides the starting point, and it is more informative than people expect. Burial sites across ancient cultures sometimes reveal height status correlations through burial treatment, the care, wealth, and elaborateness of grave goods associated with individuals of different physical statures. If ancient cultures systematically valued height and assigned higher status to taller individuals, we might expect to see taller individuals receiving more elaborate burial treatment, being interred in central or elevated positions, being accompanied by more valuable goods. Studies of this kind have produced mixed results, which is itself informative. Some ancient burial populations show modest correlations between height and burial elaborateness, consistent with a height-status link. Others show no significant correlation, with burial wealth distributed according to patterns that skeletal height does not predict. The inconsistency across populations and time periods suggests that height-status associations where they existed were not universal human features but culturally specific and contextually dependent. One of the more striking findings from archaeological burial analysis concerns sex-specific height valuations. In some ancient populations where male height correlates with burial wealth and therefore status indicators, female height shows weaker or absent correlation with similar markers. This pattern, if robust, would suggest that ancient height-status associations were specifically gendered in ways that parallel but also complicate modern findings about height preferences, which themselves show sex-specific patterns in contemporary populations. Move to the written record because literate ancient civilizations left textual evidence of how they thought about height, what they associated it with, and how it figured in their representations of ideal humans. Ancient Egypt provides one of the most extensively documented cases. Egyptian royal art systematically depicted pharaohs as larger than other figures and scenes, a convention so consistently applied that it has its own term in Egyptology: hierarchical scaling. The pharaoh is always the largest figure. His commanders are smaller. Common soldiers and servants are smaller still. The visual size of a figure in Egyptian art directly represented their social importance and power. But here is the complication. Hierarchical scaling in Egyptian art was almost certainly not a representation of actual physical height. It was a symbolic convention expressing relative status and power through visual scale, independent of any literal physical attribute. A pharaoh depicted as twice the height of his soldiers was not twice the height of his soldiers. The visual exaggeration was a representational code, not a documentary record. The existence of this convention tells us something interesting. Egyptians associated visual size with power and importance strongly enough to make it the organizing principle of their representational art. But it doesn't tell us whether they valued actual physical height in their leaders or whether the size convention was purely symbolic. Textual sources from Egypt are somewhat more illuminating. Egyptian medical texts describe ideal physical proportions with considerable specificity, and while height is referenced in these contexts, the emphasis is more consistently on proportionality and physical health than on maximal height as an independent virtue. The Egyptian aesthetic ideal appears to have been the well-proportioned, physically complete body rather than the maximally tall one. Ancient Greek sources are more explicit about their relationship to physical stature and reveal a cultural attitude toward height that is more nuanced than the height equals status summary suggests. Greek literary sources from Homer onward describe heroic figures in terms of physical impressiveness that includes, but is not limited to, height. Achilles, the Greek warrior ideal, is described with remarkable physical attributes but is not consistently described as the tallest figure in the Greek camp. That distinction belongs to other figures. The warrior ideal in Homeric epic is a composite of qualities: strength, speed, skill, courage, beauty, and lineage, with height being one element among many rather than the defining characteristic. Herodotus, in his historical writings, described Persian king Darius as taller than other men and associated this height with his kingly character. But Herodotus also described the Ethiopian ruler favorably and at great height, suggesting that height-kingship associations in his thinking may have been applied to figures from different cultural backgrounds as part of a general representational convention for powerful rulers rather than a specifically observed characteristic. The Greek philosophical tradition produced interesting commentary on physical stature that complicates simple height equals status readings. Aristotle discussed the relationship between body and character with considerable ambivalence, noting positive correlations between physical development and capacity, while also warning against equating physical presence with moral or intellectual virtue. The Socratic tradition specifically took pride in Socrates' physical unimpressiveness. His famously undistinguished and even comical appearance was treated in philosophical texts as evidence that wisdom was independent of physical attributes, a counter-narrative to any simple equation of physical stature with worth. Ancient Rome Rome provides perhaps the most documented case of the gap between height symbolism and political reality. Julius Caesar, one of the most politically and militarily dominant Romans in history, was described by ancient sources as of moderate height, not notably tall. Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor and one of the most powerful individuals of antiquity, was explicitly described as short. The Roman historian Suetonius recorded Augustus at 5 Roman feet and 9 unci, which translates to approximately 5 feet 7 inches. Not dramatically below modern averages, but below the stature of military and heroic ideal figures in Roman iconography. Augustus was aware of this and managed it carefully. His public imagery, statues, coins, monumental representations, depicted him with idealized, tall, commanding physical proportions that did not necessarily correspond to his actual stature. The gap between Augustus's physical reality and his representational image is itself evidence that height carried symbolic weight in Roman culture. Enough weight that an emperor whose actual height didn't fully match the heroic ideal found it worth managing through strategic visual representation. But the fact that Augustus successfully dominated Roman politics for decades without matching the physical height ideal also demonstrates that actual height was only one factor among many in determining status and influence in ancient Rome. Intelligence, political acumen, rhetorical ability, military success, family connections, and controlled use of symbolic power could all override physical stature in determining real-world outcomes. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. This pattern, height carrying symbolic cultural weight while actual tall stature being far from a deterministic predictor of success or status, appears repeatedly across ancient cultures and may represent the most accurate general characterization of how ancient humans related to height. It mattered symbolically and as a signal, but it operated within a complex matrix of other qualities rather than as a dominant variable. The evolutionary psychology literature provides a framework for understanding why height preferences might be a genuine feature of human psychology with ancient roots, but the same literature provides important qualifications that often get lost in popular accounts. Studies across contemporary Western populations do show height preferences in partner selection, women on average reporting preferences for taller men, height correlating positively with male reproductive success in some datasets. But these findings come with significant qualifications. The effect sizes are often modest. The preferences show cultural variation. The magnitude of height preferences differs across populations and is stronger in some cultural contexts than others. Some research has found that the height attractiveness correlation in men weakens substantially when controlling for other physical and social characteristics, suggesting that height's contribution to attractiveness is partly mediated through correlations with other desirable traits rather than being independently valued. Most importantly for the ancient question, the studies that provide the most robust height preference findings come from modern Western societies with specific conditions. Populations where caloric adequacy is nearly universal, where height variation is therefore increasingly genetic, where mass media has created homogenized beauty standards, and where height differences are experienced in specific social contexts, including formal height measurement, building architecture calibrated to specific height ranges, and clothing size systems that make height salient in daily life. Ancient human social environments were radically different. People knew each other in small groups. There was no formal height measurement. Social comparison was face-to-face and embedded in complex webs of relationship, history, and demonstrated performance rather than mediated through the kind of decontextualized first impressions that modern laboratory preference studies typically measure. The conditions that might amplify height preferences in contemporary humans were largely absent in ancient ones. Cross-cultural research on height preferences provides perhaps the most directly relevant evidence for how ancient preferences might have looked. When researchers compare height preference magnitudes across societies that differ in economic development, food security, and cultural exposure to Western media, they find meaningful variation. Societies with lower food security and higher environmental developmental variability show weaker associations between male height and reproductive outcomes in some studies, possibly because in those environments, height is so strongly influenced by developmental history that it correlates strongly with other visible health and status indicators, making it a less independently salient cue than it becomes when when nutrition is consistently adequate. The Hadza of Tanzania, a contemporary foraging population studied as a model for ancient forager social dynamics, shows some height-related preferences in partner assessment, but also show that skill, hunting success, and personality characteristics are at least as salient in partner evaluation. Male height in Hadza, mate choice research appears to be one signal among several rather than the dominant variable. The forager context matters enormously here because it's the context in which most of human evolutionary history occurred. For the vast majority of the period during which any height preferences became established in human psychology, humans lived in small foraging bands where every individual was known to every other individual, where individual reputation based on demonstrated behavior was available and highly relevant, and where the kind of height-based first impression assessment that height preference research typically measures was rarely the operative mode of social evaluation. In small communities where everyone's history is known, height as a signal may be largely redundant. The developmental history that height summarizes is already known through direct observation and community memory. The person who grew up with adequate resources, survived childhood illness robustly, and developed well is known to be that person through decades of shared experience, not inferred from their height at first meeting. Height's signaling value may scale upward with community size and anonymity, becoming more valuable as a quick red signal precisely when the richer information of long-term relationship is not available. If this is correct, height preferences would have been less important in the small group forager contexts of most human evolutionary history, and more important in the larger, more anonymous social environments that emerged with urban civilization, exactly reversing the intuition that height preferences are ancient adaptations applied to modern environments. Ancient military contexts deserve specific examination because this is where the most intuitive case for ancient height valuation can be made. In hand-to-hand combat with melee weapons, the predominant form of organized violence through most of human history, height does confer real advantages. Longer reach with hand weapons, higher mechanical advantage in certain grappling situations, greater ability to strike downward, and in some formations the ability to present a more imposing visual presence to opponents. If ancient warriors were systematically valued for height, we might expect military organizations to have selected for tall soldiers, and indeed some historical examples of this exist. The Macedonian companion cavalry under Alexander the Great, the Roman Praetorian Guard, and various elite units across history did have height requirements, or showed height-biased recruitment. The symbolic power of large, visually impressive warriors in military formations was understood by commanders across many cultures. The psychological impact of facing physically imposing opponents was part of the calculus of ancient warfare, but the evidence that height was the primary military virtue rather than strength, skill, endurance, experience, and psychological toughness is much weaker. Ancient military texts across cultures emphasize training, discipline, tactical skill, and aggressive spirit more consistently than they emphasize height. Small, quick, skilled fighters appear repeatedly in ancient military accounts as highly effective. The Greek hoplite system was specifically designed around formation discipline that reduced the individual combat advantage of any single fighter's physical attributes, including height. The documented cases of short but highly effective ancient warriors, and there are many, including multiple legendary fighters across cultures who are explicitly described as smaller than average, suggest that height was valued as one advantage among many rather than as a primary military virtue. The mating context in ancient societies produces some of the most interesting and least resolved questions about ancient height valuation. Archaeological evidence of mating patterns, who reproduced with whom, how reproductive success was distributed, is difficult to extract from the skeletal record with the specificity that would allow direct testing of height preference hypotheses in ancient populations. Ancient DNA analysis is beginning to make this possible in limited ways. Genomic studies of ancient populations can identify parent-offspring relationships in burial assemblages and can correlate physical traits, including height-associated genetic variants, with indicators of reproductive success across multiple generations. This research is in early stages for height-specific questions, but preliminary findings from some ancient European populations suggest that height-associated genetic variants were not uniformly under positive positive selection in ancient populations. The genetic signatures that would be expected if tall individuals consistently out-reproduced shorter individuals are not uniformly present across the ancient periods studied. This is indirect and preliminary evidence, but it points in a direction consistent with the other lines of evidence. That height in ancient populations was not the dominant predictor of social and reproductive success that contemporary Western research might suggest if applied anachronistically to ancient contexts. The literary and mythological record of ancient cultures reflects their height values in interesting ways. When ancient cultures created legendary heroes and ideal humans in their mythological traditions, how did they represent height? The answers are revealing. Across the mythological traditions of ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, India, China, and pre-Columbian Americas, heroic and divine figures are often described as physically imposing and large. But large, in these traditions, typically encompasses a composite of strength, physical completeness, health, and beauty, alongside height, rather than singling out height as the defining physical virtue. Divine figures in most traditions are described with qualities that go well beyond mere tallness: radiance, physical perfection, extraordinary strength, divine proportionality. When height is specifically mentioned in ancient heroic literature, it is usually as one component of an impressive physical package rather than as the single defining attribute. The ancient ideal human was typically tall and strong and beautiful and well-proportioned and healthy, a composite of developmental success markers, rather than simply tall. This composite ideal is actually consistent with what evolutionary logic would predict. If height in ancient environments was one reliable signal of developmental success among several, attending to the composite of signals rather than any single one would be more informationally efficient than height alone. Ancient aesthetic ideals that celebrated physical completeness in all dimensions rather than maximizing any single dimension may reflect exactly this adaptive logic. Returning to the two men standing outside that Mesopotamian village, the honest answer to whether anyone around them cared which was taller is probably somewhat, in some contexts, in some ways that depended enormously on the specific social situation, the specific cultural context, and the other attributes each man presented alongside his height. The taller man probably had some marginal advantage in initial impression, in appearing physically formidable to strangers in contexts where physical display was the primary available information. But in the context of a small, tight-knit ancient community where both men were known through years of direct experience, where their skill, reliability, generosity, and competence were established facts rather than inferences from appearance, height was probably a much less significant variable in how they were regarded than any modern intuition suggests. Ancient humans cared about height, but they probably cared about it less, in fewer contexts, and in more nuanced combination with other qualities than the modern height premium literature suggests when applied backward through time without sufficient qualification. The obsession with height that characterizes certain contemporary cultural contexts, the dating profile height listings, the political candidate tallness studies, the boardroom height premiums, may be as much a product of the specific conditions of modern anonymous mass society as it is a reflection of deep human nature. Ancient humans meeting each other knew each other. They had to. Their survival depended on it. And when you know someone, really know them across seasons and years and shared hardship, how tall they stand starts to matter a lot less than how they stand when things get difficult. That, more than any documented height preference, may be the most ancient and durable human value of all.